Andrew Harrop will be joining us. He is the director of the Fabian Society. They were the people who published Keir Starmer's 12,500 word essay pamphlet. So 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to phone in with your questions to our panel, and you can of course watch us on Global Player on the LBC website, YouTube channel, Facebook and Twitter feeds.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, it's understood the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has signed off the request for military assistance to help with the fuel crisis. Up to 150 drivers are preparing to drive tankers to petrol stations later this week. Earlier, the Prime Minister said demand is starting to ease. The Labour MP who resigned as Shadow Employment Secretary yesterday has told LBC he doesn't regret his decision. Andy MacDonald stepped down after disagreeing with Sir Keir Starmer over backing a £15 an hour minimum wage.
Whilst it was a difficult thing to do, it was the right thing for me to do. So I just regret that we've not been able to get the party round to thinking that £15 an hour is something we can say quite loudly and clearly.
The party voted to support the motion this afternoon. A court's heard a 36-year-old man charged with murdering primary school teacher Sabina Nessa will deny the charges. Coach Steve Salamach has been remanded in custody after appearing in front of magistrates earlier. And tributes will be paid to England 1966 World Cup winner Roger Hunt at next month's match with Hungary. Liverpool's top league goal scorer of all time has passed away, aged 83. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 35 points at 70.28. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.15. LBC weather: rain for eastern areas tonight, mostly dry elsewhere with the odd isolated shower, a low of 7 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Lucinda Horsley.
This is LBC from Global. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Now, coming up over the next hour, you're going to get your chance to put your questions to our panel here at the Labour Party conference. For the next hour, we are going to be joined by Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. Barry Gardiner is here too. He is former International Trade Secretary and Labour MP for Brent. North. I always get it wrong, so I thought I'd just ask you. And Jake Richards is here. He's a columnist for Labour List. Labour List is what?
It is the go-to gospel for all things Labour politics, so all your listeners should become subscribers immediately, I'm sure. And
later in the hour, we'll also be joined by Andrew Harrop from the Fabian Society, and Ben Kentish and Theo Usherwood may be putting in an appearance too. And you can watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk, and the LBC Facebook, YouTube and Twitter feeds.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's crack on with our first question. It comes from Simon in Southampton. Simon, what would you like to ask?
Good evening.
Hi.
I don't need convincing because I want a universal basic income. So Labour are backing £15 an hour. Like I said, I don't need convincing. How would you convey that to people like my parents, whose go-to position on Labour is they do nothing but give out sweets and bankrupt the country? How would you get them to go from that position to that's a good idea?
See, you have just brought back a memory for me, Simon, because my grandmother, when I was about 12 years old, said to me, never trust Labour because Michael Foot's a communist and Labour always spend more money than they can afford. And here we are in 2021 with Simon's parents thinking exactly, well, not about Michael Foot. Jay, let's come to you first. This is, I mean, I don't know about you, but I didn't see this issue coming. I've never heard anybody suggesting a £15 a week, £15 an hour national minimum wage before, and yet here it suddenly is tearing the party apart.
Well, yes, and there may be other motives for that. I mean, Andy MacDonald, who you just had on the show, has been campaigning for a £10 national minimum wage, which is Keir Starmer's policy. and it was in the 29 manifesto, election manifesto for £10, and all of a sudden £15 has emerged from somewhere. We're not sure where, and I think we can all kind of raise our eyebrows gently about that. Going back to the caller's question, it's a very good question, and I think that actually one of the big moments of this conference so far has been Rachel Reeves' speech, and her real insistence that Labour has to be a party of fiscal credibility. And that was a really important moment.
She's a new Golden Brown, isn't she?
I think she would quite like that comparison, and hopefully she will be the next Chancellor. But yes, she set out fiscal rules, and the Labour Party will be very clear to the public going to the next general election. They can be trusted with the money. And Rachel Reeves is someone that I think takes that very seriously and will be a very good figurehead for Labour to try and counteract what your grandmother thought of the Labour Party and what this caller is worried about his parents too. And we've got a lot of work to do.
Mary, look, everybody's going to say, well, if you're on a lower wage than that, everyone's going to say, well, of course, we'd love to have a £15 minimum wage. But it's what, 40% higher than the current rate. It's higher than the median average income in this country. Where's it come from?
I don't know where it's come from. I suspect that Jake's got a better idea about that than me.
We should say that your union is not affiliated.
Our union isn't affiliated to the Labour Party, and so I don't know where it's come from. I would say I've got a bit of a different view. And my view is that wages in this country are just too low. And that leaves my members, teachers and support staff, over the pandemic, over Zoom, looking into children's rooms where children are hungry, where they're cold. My union put £1 million in to help a child to learn to buy pens and paper for children who had no pens and paper at home. The level of child poverty, and most of those children will have, 2/3 of those children will have parents who are working for their poverty. They're working in very low pay, very insecure work. Now, there's been an academic from the University of Loughborough who's recently said that the level of child poverty in this country will cost £38 billion a year because child poverty brings mental illness, it brings physical illness, it brings depression, it brings low skills, so people aren't as productive. So I don't know where the £15 has come from, but I will say that a minimum wage of £8.91 an hour, if you're over 23, is inadequate when you've got rising fuel prices, rising energy prices, when you've got CPI at 2.4%, and when you've got the vast majority of children with working parents who are in poverty. They are working, and we have to do something about that. And £10 was a policy which has been around for about 2 years, and inflation has gone on since then. So I don't know about £15, but I will say, in answer to the question, that low pay has all sorts of knock-on consequences. It means an increase in taxes. More people have to have universal credit to top up their wages. Low pay is very expensive, and the move towards paying people decently for the decent work that they do is really important.
Barry?
I think that the caller is absolutely right to be arguing with his parents. I think that the place that the £15 figure has come from is twofold. The first is the campaign that the Mac workers, the McDonald's workers, ran for a £15 an hour campaign, which Keir Starmer was supporting, behind the banner there, supporting it on that during the leadership campaign. The second place I think it's come from is actually the pandemic itself. Because I think what all of us have realised during the pandemic is that care workers, key workers, these are the people, they're the glue that holds our society together. And if you're a care worker that has been working without proper PPE, seeing your charges, the people that you've cared for and loved dying, and actually many of your colleagues dying as well, I think society has come to realise that actually, you know what, you're worth £15 an hour. And as to fiscal competence...
I don't think anybody's arguing that a lot of people aren't worth at least £15 an hour. I would happily pay care workers a lot more than that. If I had my parents or grandparents in a care home, I wouldn't want them necessarily to be cared for by somebody who's just on minimum wage. I think that's a natural thing. But if you look at it from a different perspective, if you say to a small business that employs 5 or 6 people, suddenly your wage costs are going to go up by 40%, that could send them out of business. So you're kind of defeating the object.
Well, let me talk about the fiscal competence, because that was the point that Jake raised, and I think very, very properly. But I think Mary partially answered that question. And what we find at the moment is that half of the people who are on universal credit are in work. They're working. And what that means is that we, the taxpayers, are actually subsidising their low wages.
That was brought in by Gordon Brown under his tax credits.
Well, this is the universal credit system, and we need to change it.
It's the replacement for it.
I'm not making a party political point. I'm trying to answer your caller's question, because the concern is, how can we afford this? And I think the answer is, how can we afford not to? Because actually, we, the taxpayer, are subsidising low wages to ensure that people can feed their children, pay their rent, heat their homes, and at the same time, what's happening is employers are trying to drive those wages down in order to increase the profits to their shareholders. Now, that means you're siphoning money from the poorest people in society to the richest people in society, and you're using the benefit system to do it. I don't think that's right, and I think one of the ways through that, as well as all the very good reasons that Mary said about the mental health problems and the problems in later life that are costing our economy £38 billion a year, I think this is the way that we have to go. We have to raise the standards, and that raises the economy.
But what are we
for everyone.
to make of the situation where the shadow cabinet and the Labour leader signs off Andy MacDonald's green paper, which had £10 an hour in it, and yet suddenly he seems to be very much against that, and then the conference this afternoon votes to overturn that and vote for £15 an hour on the basis that, that sounds like a good thing with the Labour Party. Of course we want to see higher wages. I mean, to the electorate, that does not look like a government in waiting.
Well, I think to go back to the manifesto commitment that you had 2 years ago, let's say 2 years ahead of the next election, doesn't sound like a government in waiting. It sounds like a retrospective look at 4 years from when the next election will be. I think what we need to be doing is we need to be setting the higher standard for the next election. Now, Andy is somebody who's always argued for working people and for employment law. He clearly felt very passionately about it, and I think he, on a point of principle, decided that he couldn't go into that meeting and argue for something that he didn't believe in. Now,
but he had argued for it for the last 2 years,
and no doubt, and no doubt he had those discussions internally in the shadow cabinet. But the point is this: that the conference then decided who they thought was right, and they thought Andy was right.
But they're whistling in the wind, aren't they? Because the leader doesn't have to obey the conference resolution.
No, indeed it doesn't. The leadership doesn't have to obey the conference resolution. But what the leaders
did it in the good old days, didn't they?
What the leadership does need to do is to show that it's listening to people, not just in our party, but out there in the community, like your caller who's just called.
Right, let's go on to another question. Mary's going to like this one. It's from Chris in Croydon. Hello, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel.
Hi.
My question is the proposed removal of charitable status from private schools motivated by egalitarian spite?
Mary?
No, I don't think it is motivated by egalitarian spite. I think that at the moment, independent schools get automatic relief from the charitable status and tax relief based on that. And there's meant to be a test for that, or there was meant to be a test for that, but that was, that was resisted. And so we've got many members. We've got over 30,000 members in the independent sector, and I think the thing that we have to understand about the independent sector, it has a huge range of schools. So you've got your Eton and your Harrows and all those, but you've also got a whole load of independent special schools which are which run for very high need, very specialist services for children and young people, and local authorities that they're largely that their intake is largely children with very profound learning or physical difficulties who are paid for, the fees are paid for by the local authority. So I think what we have to do And what Labour would have to do is, rather than have a blanket just no charitable status for independent schools, there should be a proper test about whether you are really fulfilling a charitable duty or not. And that would involve these schools having to show what they were doing to fulfil their charitable status. And it would need to be a rigorous test, because there are real questions to be asked for schools with massive endowments like Eton and like the other schools with millions and millions of pounds in endowments and huge playing fields, and giving a very, very privileged education for very privileged young people. There has to be questions asked about whether they are in fact earning charitable status. But I think the key thing to note is that not all independent schools are like that, and the policy needs more nuance than it has presently.
Nuance in 2021?
I'm all for nuance.
What planet are you living on, Mary?
Well, I'm a very nuanced woman. And I'm all for nuance.
I've always thought so. Barry?
I think Mary's absolutely right. I think that the charitable status is not appropriate for so many of the independent small schools who are simply running businesses, and that's the reality of it. I think, as she says, there are many schools who do perform charitable status, particularly those that are dealing with disabled children and so on. And we need to look very carefully at that as to whether they are or are not charities. I make full disclosure. I went to an independent school myself. I went to a public school.
I always thought you were a bit posh.
Well, I'm just telling you because I don't want any listener phoning up and saying, oh yes, but, I don't want to be hypocritical about it. I went to one. That was my parents' decision. I did not send my children.
My parents wanted to send me to one, and I refused to go.
Well, you're a very, very independent thinking man. Well done, Ian. But look, I think Mary's hit the nail absolutely on the head. We do need to look carefully at individual situations and have that nuance that she spoke of.
Jake, have you got any confessions that you'd like to sort of bring up now?
No, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said by Mary and Barry. I would just add the other side of the coin. What are we using that money to pay for? And I think one of the most impressive performers at this conference, again, has been Wedge Streeting, your old friend Ian, who has been really impressive in saying that actually we want to make private schools redundant. We want to put them out of business because we want to create a state system which every parent in this country, regardless if they're millionaires or whatever, are happy and proud and want to send their children to those schools. And that's a huge ambition. So there are two sides to this. This is not a policy devised out of spite, as your caller suggested. This is a policy devised out of fairness. And I think that Wes Streeting is the right person to lead that policy agenda for Labour going forward.
But to play devil's advocate for a second, if somebody wishes to use their hard-earned income to send their children to a private school, why on earth shouldn't they be allowed to? I mean, there are lots of people listening to this programme right now who no one would describe as rich. They're middle-class parents who have sacrificed a huge amount because the state has failed to provide in their particular local area, and they are not one of these parents who moves areas to get to a good school. They know for the next 10 years they're not going to go on foreign holidays because they're putting all their money into their child's education. Why shouldn't they be able to do that?
No, and there are examples of that. I think there's two issues there. One is the charitable exemption. As Mary's already said, what are these schools doing to get this huge tax exemption? And actually, I have no idea what Eton do. I know they give some bursaries out, but you see that their fields and glorious football pitches and rugby pitches, they're hardly used in the summer. What are they doing? They could do a lot more. And so what Labour are not saying is we're not going to let you spend your money to send your children to the school that you want. That wouldn't be the right approach. What we are going to do is put them out of business by making state schools the best in the world. And if they are going to be charities, do some charitable work. Because I'm afraid at the moment too many don't do anything.
I noticed you didn't make a confession about your own education.
I'm happy to. I went to a mixture of schools. I was at a private school for a period as well. But yes.
Mary, did you go to a private school?
No, I didn't.
I was wanted to be the only one here. Somebody's just texted in, is Iain Dale more of a socialist than Barry Gardiner? We'll leave that question hanging. Chris, come back. What do you think? You obviously think it is motivated by egalitarian spite, I guess, given your question.
Yes, comprehensive schools. They've been an egalitarian disaster. They were marketed as meritocratic, but they ended up being egalitarian, bog size fill all. And there again, why do so many people scrimp and save to avoid sending their children to them? And in many, actually, state school staff rooms, you'll have at least one teacher, usually a woman, who's married to a professional man. Her salary provides for the fees for their children to go to a private school. You ask so many staff rooms I've been in, you ask the staff, would you send your child to this school? And the answer comes back, no, over my dead body.
Well, I just think that's a load of...
Careful. Before 9 o'clock.
Yeah, no, I just think that's just a load of prejudice all rolled up into one. The vast majority of schools, state schools, are doing an excellent job. We've raised standards of education hugely through the hard work of professionals, and that's happened at a time when funding for state education has gone down. Standards are incredibly high, and actually... when you take away the economic advantage that pupils have going to independent schools, state schools do just as well. So, you can throw the mud around, but it's not going to stick for state education.
And can I just say, I don't object to anybody spending their hard-earned money to make a decision about their child's education that they want to pay for it. What I do object to is when they expect the rest of us to give them a tax break in order to do so. And I think that's only fair.
Well, I'm tempted to ask Chris Mason from the BBC, who's over the way there. He's a big fan of this programme. He listens a lot because he texts me after some of the programmes. Of course, he hosts the Radio 4 equivalent Any Questions.
I'm on his programme on Friday in Bolton.
Well, there you go. I'm tempted to ask him to join us as a temporary panellist, but he's doing a report on the news channel, I think, so I better not. Anyway, we will take another question in just a few moments' time. It's 8:20.
LBC.
A stripy jacket?
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It is 23 minutes past 8 on Cross Question. Let me tell you who we've got answering your questions. Barry Gardiner is here, Mary Bousted from the National Education Union, and Jake Richards from Labour List. Right, we have Kieran in Leeds now. Hi, Kieran.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel.
Hi, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi. I'd just like to ask, given the hard left versus starboard dynamic that's completely overshadowed this conference, does the panel think a formal split is the only way forward for the left and the Labour Party?
Now, I saw on Twitter earlier, Barry, that you were introducing Jeremy Corbyn at some big rally this evening. Or was that, am I imagining that? You're looking at me rather quizzically. And I've seen him around the conference today, and he is still greeted as the absolute boy, as the phrase goes. Do you think that in other countries with a different electoral system, you would have two left of centre parties, but our electoral system doesn't really work that way? But do you think there might be a danger soon that the left of the Labour Party might split away?
No, I really don't. Absolutely not. I think it's important that our party is united, because it's only as a united party that we will be able to do the things that we believe in ensuring that there's good work for everyone, that Britain is the best place to work, taking, good care of people in their old age by a proper social care plan that's integrated with the National Health Service. These are the things that everyone in the Labour Party cares about. And we are strange in many ways in that we hold these debates in public. We are very clear about our differences, but ultimately we know we have to unite, and we have to unite because we need a Labour government to deliver for the people that I'm sure Kieran cares about. So, Kieran, no, it's not the way forward. The way forward is to be a united party. Yes, let's have our passionate disagreement, but let's make sure that ultimately we unite behind the leadership of the party, go forward and win the next general election.
Jake?
It's good to hear Barry uniting behind Keir Starmer this evening. Look, I think, of course, the Labour Party has always been a broad church, and it will remain to be a broad church. And of course, we do have to unite when we go into the next general election. The thing about this conference is unity cannot come by compromising on some basic principles and positions. And Keir Starmer's made that clear. One, on anti-Semitism, he said this is a motion that we have to pass to adopt the definition that Jeremy Corbyn refused to do when he was leader, and he's done that. That's Momentum voted against that, but he's done that. He needed to change the rules about deselection because we don't want our MPs spending all their time worrying about their membership and instead worrying about the electorate. And he's changed the rules about how we elect a leader to ensure that any leader that's elected in the future has support of a decent chunk of the parliamentary party.
And won't be from the left of the party.
Well, it might very well be from the left of the party, but they'll have some support, hopefully, amongst their colleagues. Now, these are very basic principles and positions that any sensible party has to adopt. If the left of the party are going to kick up a fuss about that, then so be it, I'm afraid. This is something Keir had to do, and he's done it. Tomorrow he's making a speech, and I'm really pleased that Barry and other members of the Corbyn wing of the party will be uniting behind him tomorrow, I'm sure.
Sorry, I do have to just come in against that. I am not the Corbyn wing of the party. I have never been any wing of the party. I believe in the Labour Party. I believe in a united party, and that cuts both ways, Jake. It's not just, that the criticism comes from left to right. It also comes from right to left, and we all need to make sure that we're a united party, not just one section of it. Now, you set out some principles. Yes, let's have those principles. Let's make sure consistency is one of those principles. And when we're talking about principles, let's make sure that we deliver on the promises that we made when we actually stood for office. So, let's be absolutely clear. We must go forward as a united party, but we must do that actually by having the debates that are political debates, and not smear and spread lies and muck. Okay? So the way in which you implied that all people on the left of the party were anti-Semitic is absolutely unacceptable.
I don't think
well,
he did
okay,
that.
in that case...
I certainly didn't mean to do that anyway.
Good. In that case, that's great. Let's bury that one there, but let's make sure that we do go forward as a united party, agreed around policies that are going to deliver for the people out there, and not on internal spats and internal motions.
Mary, I'm glad you're sitting between these two at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with the left is that, the issue with the right and the Tories is that they may be having huge ideological rows, but they do so in a much more private and managed way. And I'm going to the Tory party conference, the Conservative Party conference next week, and it will be a very stage managed affair, and it will look very professional. Now, it appears to me sometimes that on the left, you can have more fierce rows with somebody who you think is on another section of the party than you can have with the party which you're meant to be opposing. Exactly. And so sometimes you have to do things, and there are going to be disagreements. What I can't understand at this conference and on the left is why the disagreements are so vicious, why they're so personal, and why they do not help the party become electable. It's not an electable, when you've got heckling in the hall, when you've got shouting at each other, and neither does it add anything to the debate.
Absolutely right.
Adding and heckling and shouting and calling other names do not add anything of substance to a debate. So my plea to the left, because we're not an affiliated union, but I'm a member of the party, and my plea is that we have more civilised conduct of these key debates within the party.
You've been reading my book, haven't you?
Yes.
Can I just say, I think Margaret Beckett, when she spoke the other day, and she's someone I think really is able to bridge the divide within the party. She spoke about having respectful debates. She spoke about courtesy. She spoke about the way we should treat each other decently and with comradely affection. Sometimes we have huge policy differences. That's fine. But let's actually respect each other in those differences, and most of all, listen to each other so that we might actually learn something as well.
A friend of mine once described you as the acceptable face of the Corbyn shadow cabinet. I don't know whether you take that as a compliment or not, Barry. I think you should, actually. Jake, we're going to be losing you now for the next half an hour. You're going to be replaced on the panel by Andrew Harrop, who's director of the Fabian Society. It's 8:30 on LBC. Lucinda Horsley has the news headlines.
It's understood the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has signed off the request for military assistance to help with the fuel crisis. Up to 150 drivers are preparing to drive tankers to petrol stations later this week to deal with a shortage. Labour members have voted in favour of raising the national minimum wage to £15 an hour. Yesterday, the Shadow Employment Secretary resigned after claiming he'd been told to vote against it. Virgin Atlantic says it won't take on any new cabin crew or pilots who haven't been vaccinated against COVID. The airline says getting jabbed is strongly encouraged for existing staff, but not compulsory. LBC weather: rain for eastern areas tonight, mostly dry elsewhere with the odd isolated shower, a low of 7 degrees.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:34 on LBC. Jake Richards has transmogrified into Andrew Harrop, who's director of the Fabian Society. Now, Andrew, welcome. You published this massive, well, it's not massive, is it? It's a pamphlet by Keir Starmer. How's that been received?
I think people have found it really useful to have Keir set out at length what he stands for and, his sort of backstory that brought him into politics. It's been a bit of a guide to, I think, a lot of the themes we'll hear from his speech tomorrow, and sort of reset what the Labour Party's about after the pandemic and, the sort of huge trauma that we've been through as a country. And he's basically saying there are some traditional centre-left values that are actually more relevant now than they've ever been, about people coming together, society coming together, and wanting more security in their lives and more opportunity.
Okay. Right, let's go to our next caller. It's Barbara in Greenwich. Hello, Barbara.
Hello, Ian.
Hi.
I'm so happy to be given this chance to ask this question. Hello, panel. Children's social care is incredibly unfair and is based on postcode lottery. For example, a child with some illness may be getting, say, 30 hours a week in one borough, but then another child with the same condition in another borough may be getting 0 hours of help. How can you help families down all over UK to make it fair? What would you do to make it fair for all the families in the United Kingdom?
That's a really good question, isn't it? Because we talk about a national health service, but we know that in some parts of the country, if you're treated for cancer, you get treated better than possibly in others. It's very difficult to avoid a postcode lottery in a way, isn't it, Mary?
It is difficult, but the issue is, and this is the issue with children with all sorts of special needs, is that the funding just simply isn't there to provide the level of care which parents need, either for social care or for when those children start school, for the care that they need in school if they've got special educational needs and disabilities. And that's because it's just simply underfunded, as is all of children's services. They are underfunded. So that means that virtually everywhere you go, parents will be concerned that the level of support they get is insufficient. But it's absolutely the case that you are not going to get the same level of support for the same condition in different local authorities, and that depends on the level of debt for the local authority. It depends on how many of their support services have been able to retain, and it's been hugely affected by the cut in local government funding, which means that for children's services there's been about nearly a 50% cut in services since 2010 for children. So those who are vulnerable, those with need for either physical care, those for more educational care, they are finding that, well, one parent said to me very recently, a child who has a child with profound physical and mental disabilities, said that the struggle to get the support they need is framed through anxiety and despair. That it's just a constant struggle, and that's why you end up with so many parents going to court to get the support they need. It's something that has to be reformed from the basis, I think.
And Andrew, it is partly about national funding as well, but it's also about local political priorities. Council leaders, they have to decide where they're going to allocate the money and whether to spend £50 million on repairing roads or £50 million on children's services. I mean, it's not quite that simple, but you know what I say. Do you think that maybe local politicians need to reevaluate their priorities as well?
My partner is actually the boss of a charity for disabled children.
Well, there we go. Of course, so I knew that. That's why we picked this question.
It's really close to our heart. I agree with everything that Mary just said, but the consequences of it is that it's only the very most vulnerable disabled children who are getting services, and often very late after a massive fight to get support. And that means, local services aren't stepping in early to help, so when problems first emerge, to help parents deal with, the surprise, the shock of having a disabled child. And so it's a massive waste of money because, we're not sort of creating preventative public services. Of course, political priorities matter, but you really can't blame the councils because, whether they're Labour or Conservative, they are under huge pressure for everything. Laura,
you're right. I'm not saying I blame councils, but I mean, to govern is to choose, isn't it? If you've got control of a budget, you decide how you allocate the funds, and you decide, well, that has to be more important than another area of policy. And if you scatter it too thinly, you're going to be accused of sort of not funding anything properly. That's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, I mean, Labour councils up and down the country have made incredibly difficult and tough decisions, proving they govern well locally. But it does mean you have to, unfortunately, first of all, to deal with your statutory requirements, and that is, keeping very vulnerable children safe and looking after older and adult disabled people. There is no fat left in the public realm to do the nice to have and the preventative. There has to be more money in the system.
Barry, if you could be quite brief on this answer, but in your role as constituency MP, you presumably have a lot of casework on this sort of thing.
They're some of the most distressing cases I ever have. Mothers who, very often the families have been torn apart because of the strains of looking after a severely disabled child, not being able to get the funding. But I wanted to address the issue of resources and the choices that have to be made. Because one of the most difficult things politically is knowing that if you put the full resource into child social services and the statutory requirements that you have there and really funded them in the way that Andrew and Mary are suggesting, actually a lot more people are affected by roads and litter and things like that. So you may not be in a position to do it because the electorate may say, oh, well, look at the state of the roads, and they will vote on that because they haven't got a disabled child. Yeah. And that's why these choices are so difficult for local
That's political leadership, isn't it? To do something that you know might be relatively unpopular.
Yeah.
But if you're an MP in a safe seat, or if you're a council, which has always been one party from the time immemorial, you can actually do that sort of thing. You've got the political capital to be able to spend it, whereas if you're always in a marginal political seat or council area, it's much more difficult. Really interesting answers. Thank you very much, Barbara, for the question. Let's quickly go to Stuart in Shropshire. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, Ian. Hi, panel. My question is, it's the duty of the broad left to keep the Tories out of government. And with the demise of UKIP and the rise of the SNP in Scotland, it's going to be increasingly, possibly impossible for Labour to win an election on their own. Couldn't they swallow their pride and form a broad left coalition with the Lib Dems and the Green Party just to get the Tories out?
So this idea of a so-called progressive alliance, Andrew?
So I've just come from a Fabian Society meeting that was discussing exactly this point. Labour does have a massive challenge. It needs to win 123 seats to get a majority of one, and that means reaching out to the sort of places Labour's not won for a long time. So there is a case for it, but I think people do worry about sort of the legitimacy of it. It's sort of seeming like sort of a fake, sort of quick way round, when actually people like choice. I think you could look to what happened in the 1990s when there were sort of informal understandings between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, where people were sort of given the permission to vote tactically for the party that's most likely to defeat the Tories in any single area. But I'm a bit more sceptical about going for a fully fledged pact. I think a pact after an election might well be needed, because I think Labour could be a minority government, but not necessarily a majority. But doing that sort of formal alliance beforehand, I think a lot of voters might react against it.
Mary?
I don't think the Lib Dems would do it. I mean, look how they were decimated in the 2015 election after having been in coalition with the Tories, and they're just sort of desperately trying to build back up after that, so I don't think they do it. But I do think that there is an interesting debate to be had around proportional representation, though.
Is there?
Yeah.
Really?
Well, I'm interested in it. I think that's interesting. I think the first past the post leads to these huge majorities which aren't really, and then leads to governments which, like the current one, it's very difficult to hold them to account.
We could say that about the Labour government from 1997 to 2010, couldn't you?
Yeah, you could.
OK. Barry?
I don't like coalitions because you make a promise to the electorate and then you should be judged on whether you deliver on it. When you go into coalition either before or after, what often happens is at the end of the time, politicians turn around and say, oh, well, of course, I couldn't do that, what I promised you 5 years ago, because my coalition partner wouldn't let me.
That's a very good impression of Nick Clegg, if I may say so.
I agree with you.
Yeah, well done. Martin, you presumably think... Sorry, Stuart, you think this should this kind of pact should go ahead?
My impression is that the current circumstances, I think that we'll have a Tory government for the next 20 years, and if Labour choose to go out on their own policies, which are admirable, they'll be admirable in opposition.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Barry is going to be leaving us in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to get Martin in Wembley on the line because he's got a message for Barry. Hello, Martin.
Hi. So basically, Barry, I don't know if you do remember last year I did contact you at the beginning of the pandemic where I was homeless and where Brent Council was rejecting me constantly. And when I did write to you and your PA, I believe Jackie, you guys actually did help me. So I do want to say a big thank you to you guys. And without you, I wouldn't be where I am now, like working now and big improvements in my life. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin, for saying that. That's really kind. And Jackie's an absolutely wonderful office manager that I have, and I know she takes every case that we deal with really, really sensitively and seriously. And I'm just delighted that it's helped you get your life on track. Thank you.
Well, Martin, I'm really glad you phoned in because I think, sometimes people see MPs that they're sort of having a go at each other and they have no idea what they do in their constituencies. And what Barry did for Martin, I would say virtually every MP will have some similar story, but they get no thanks for it because nobody knows about it apart from the person that it's affected. So, well done.
Well done.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming on. Your third appearance on the programme in 2 days. I think that is some sort of record. Barry is off to party.
I wish.
Ben Kentish is going to replace him in just a moment. It's 8:46.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player.
Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas Simmons. Do you agree that the minimum wage should go up to £15?
Our position is a minimum of £10 an hour.
You know what the minimum wage is now then currently, don't you?
Yes. Well, it's certainly it's below £10, Nick. I don't know off the top of my head.
So you're talking about an increase from a figure and you don't know what the initial figure is?
It would represent a 12% rise, Nick.
But shouldn't you know what it is currently?
Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
With the British Airways American Express Accelerating Business Card, check out the world.
LB
Capital at risk.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:49. Barry Gardiner has been replaced as if by magic with Ben Kentish, our Westminster correspondent. Andrew Harrop, Mary Bousted still here. Let's go to another question. It's David in Enfield. Hi, David.
Good evening, panel. In the post-Trump political era, it appears to me that a successful party leader must be charismatic, a populist, a nationalist in the sense of having a strong sense of patriotism, a disruptor, somebody prepared to challenge the status quo and be provocative and outrageous, and most importantly, a super salesman. Does Keith Starmer fit the bill?
Andrew. You'd have to say yes, since you published his pamphlet.
Donald Trump is one model, but look what's just happened in Germany, where you have Olaf Scholz, the new presumptive chancellor, who is a moderate figure of the centre-left, who is seen as technocratic, reliable, dependable, and the German people have just decided that they want him to be their chancellor. So you don't have to be...
Well, not quite. He only got 25% of the vote, and it's possible that he might not be. I think it's probable that he will be. But...
or Joe Biden, if you prefer. I mean, I think we're in a really fluid, sort of time of polarisation in politics, where electorates move around a lot, and if they've had a populist, showman type figure, they often go back to the reassurance of someone they know can actually run the country properly, and Keir Starmer is that sort of figure.
Mary?
I think that being charismatic helps, because, one of the things you have to do is sell your policies and be able to talk about them with conviction and with sometimes wit and certainly with fervour. I don't think being a populist, I think populism is going a bit out of fashion, and Biden and Scholz showing that, and Bolsonaro, and populists aren't doing very well with COVID, so I don't think being a populist is there. Being a disruptor, I think as a leader, yes, you do have to disrupt sometimes, but you also have to build consensus. You have to build consensus in your party and try and get some consensus with the electorate as well. So you have to disrupt at times, but more of the time you have to be building your case about why you are a safe pair of hands to govern. And as super salesman, you have to be a good salesman.
And Ben, this is why the speech tomorrow is so important, isn't it?
It's key, and I think the Joe Biden example is a good one for Keir Starmer. This is someone who is not a disruptor, who's not a populist, who's in some ways the archetypal career politician, the archetypal institutional politician that in some ways can form some sort of inspiration for Keir Starmer. And if you look at British Prime Ministers, they do tend to alternate between charismatic, dynamic figures.
You've stolen my line.
Blair turned into Brown, Brown turned into Cameron, was pretty charismatic. He was replaced by May. Johnson is certainly dynamic, but a lot of things also depends on the political context that the leaders operate in. If, as many people expect, the cost of living rises, there is an economic situation that is tricky for people, then actually people start to turn towards competence, towards solidity, and that's one of the things that Labour leaders' team hope may happen. But you're absolutely right, the speech is key. The bar has been set very, very high. Talking to his team this afternoon, they are confident they will meet it. I understand it will be largely about who Keir Starmer is and what he stands for. And we're not going to have these big flagship policy announcements like we saw under Jeremy Corbyn. One member of his team saying to me, we're past the days where we promised everyone a free owl. So no owls will be announced tomorrow. I don't expect much policy, but this is, they say, the big opportunity for Keir Starmer to start to spell out exactly who he is as a man, as a leader.
I remember a Labour Party conference not that long ago where Theo Usherwood was telling us that Ed Miliband was going to introduce himself to the nation, tell us the man that he... I mean, all politics is cyclical, isn't it? And I wonder whether this one will be any more successful than Ed Miliband was. Now, a related question. David, thank you for that. Dehenna's in Bristol. Hello, Dehenna.
It's a text.
It's a text. Sorry, I'm being completely incompetent. That's always happens on this one when there's a texter. Right. Has Keir Starmer missed a trick by not doing more media during this conference, especially considering the fuel crisis? Apart from the Andrew Marr interview, and he's appeared a couple of times on the stage, he really hasn't done an awful lot. And you think, well, shouldn't he be taking the fight to the Tories more? That's surely what the Labour Party membership want, Andrew Harrop.
I think we'll probably see that tomorrow in his speech. So I know that the draft that he had at the start of the week was very much based on the Fabian Society pamphlet he published with us. But I think it will have been rewritten over the last day or so to attack the competence of this government and say that, whatever your personal politics, Boris Johnson is just failing to run the country at a time of crisis. And that is one of the reasons people should think about Keir Starmer, as well as the values he's going to talk about. And there's a lot of policies been announced this week already. So Rachel Reeves' speech yesterday was packed with policy. But you've got to trust a government, a potential government in waiting. It's not just about what they'll do, it's who will do it. So that's why it's really important that Keir Starmer introduces himself as a person.
And isn't it also important that he spells out some alternative policies as well? Because I think that's been a real problem for him when he can't. All he can say is saying, well, OK, you want the £20 a week universal credit cap. OK, I understand that. How are you going to pay for it? Well, those with the broader shoulders must pay, he says. It doesn't cut it, does it?
Well, you saw yesterday Rachel Reeves announced £28 billion a year of spending on green investment. That's a massive dividing line compared to the Conservatives. And actually, although it's been controversial in the party, some of the employment policies that have been announced this week, they go far further than any Labour leader, including, we talked about Ed Miliband a moment ago, apart from Jeremy Corbyn. On employment rights, it's a massive package and it positions Keir Starmer sort of well to the left of the Tony Blair years.
Mary?
If Keir wasn't going to do it, then other members of the Shadow Cabinet needed to step out and really, it would have done two things. It would have stopped a bit of the reporting of the fractiousness of this conference. And, it's just an open goal. It's an open goal. Johnson was warned in April that there were going to be shortages of heavy goods vehicles drivers. And why is it now we've got to October and we're taking back control by the army being trained to drive petrol tankers? It is such an open goal. It is such a lack of competence, and it's such an illustration of what I am told constantly by business leaders, which is that they go in and they say there are going to be these issues with our business because of a hard Brexit, because of the speed at which it was done, because of the lack of detail by which it was thought through. And they're just ignored. Now the chickens are coming home to roost, and we need an opposition which will make that perfectly clear. And they need to explain what the link between Brexit and the lack of petrol, Brexit and the lack of food on the shelves is about.
Ben?
I think Mary nailed it, really. It's very hard to understand, Ian. Keir Starmer doesn't need to lay out this huge, elaborate alternative. All Keir Starmer needs to do in this issue is be seen, be visible, keep the pressure up on the government, call on Boris Johnson to maybe convene Cobra, ask where the Prime Minister is, ask where the grip is. And yet he's surrounded by cameras, he's surrounded by all the political journalists in the country pretty much are here. He's got microphones everywhere, and we didn't hear from him for 2.5 days until this afternoon. Now, those interviews were meant to be tomorrow. They did bring them forward, I think, partly to fill that vacuum. But it is very hard to understand when you're faced with such an open goal, a national crisis. Boris Johnson hasn't been particularly present on this either. Why was Keir Starmer not using this conference, the 4 or 5 days a year when Labour is guaranteed the media spotlight, to make the most of it, to maximise the political advantage that he could get from it, to keep the pressure up from Boris Johnson? That's not just my view, that's the view of even some members of his shadow cabinet who are pretty supportive of him. Generally, there's a frustration amongst left-wing members, but also amongst some MPs, that he hasn't done more. He and his team, I think, are of the view that they don't need to. They can simply let these things play out, let the government tie themselves in knots and step back. But there's a concern about scoring political points. They're quite scarred by Boris Johnson's suggestion during the pandemic that they were playing politics. But if the leader of the opposition isn't about playing politics, then frankly, what is it about?
But this is different. This isn't a pandemic. This is a human-made crisis. That fuel is not being delivered. That school buses can't run. That ambulances are going around looking for fuel, and that is the result of a crisis which was warned about in April. So this isn't scoring political points. This is doing politics.
No, but also, it's easy to blame the government for everything, but it's actually the haulage companies that are to blame here, because they should have been recruiting drivers and they should have been paying them properly.
Yeah.
It's also the government's fault for IR35, so there's all sorts of blame to go around here.
But the question was the Labour Party, and the Labour Party should be pinning the blame on the government.
Absolutely right. All right, fun question on a text at the end, which is what people always dread. This is from Lucy in Milton Keynes. I'm heartbroken, says Lucy, that Daniel Craig won't be James Bond for much longer. Who do you think should replace him, Ben Kentish?
Keir Starmer. It's got to be Idris Elba, hasn't it?
Has it?
Yeah, on a serious level, it's got to be Idris Elba for me.
Okay, Mary?
I really fancy James Norton. Is it James Norton?
James Norton.
Yes, James Norton.
Who's he?
He's a very good actor. He played the vicar.
He did a BBC drama on Mafia called
Mafia.
No,
Star of that.
Seen that.
Yeah.
Don't know him.
He's very lovely.
I thought you were going to say it should be a woman, but you didn't.
No.
Andrew?
Goodness, Riz Ahmed, maybe?
Who? Oh, no, I do know him. I could see
but
that.
there's a serious point about James Bond now. I love James Bond, but it does feel pretty uncomfortable watching some of those old Bonds now. I think, he needs a real reboot in terms of his...
Phoebe Waller's come in to do that, but Peter Kyle's here. He could be quite James Bondy.
Actually, you're right. We're going to be speaking to Peter Kyle in the next hour, but I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first gay James Bond. I'm not sure that would work, would it?
I think it'd be great.
Oh, he's looking very offended now. Oh dear, what have I done? He's going to walk out now. We won't have a guest in the first quarter of the next hour. Right, thank you very much indeed to Andrew, to Mary and to Ben. So coming up in the next hour, I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think Keir Starmer needs to do in his speech tomorrow to maybe inspire you, to maybe rejuvenate the party, to maybe reunite the party, because I don't think anybody could say that it hasn't been a slightly difficult week for him in some senses. Not every conference you get somebody resigning from your shadow cabinet. So what do you want to hear from Keir Starmer tomorrow? 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has signed off the request for military assistance to help with the fuel crisis. Up to 300 troops are being trained up and deployed if needed to help with the shortage of HGV drivers. Earlier, Boris Johnson said demand is starting to ease at petrol stations around the country. Gordon Barmer is Executive Director of the Petrol Retailers Association.
Obviously, a lot of people who have got fuel over the last few days have got their tanks reasonably full now, and if we can have a bit of respite to then replenish the network, that would be our hope.
Labour's party conference has voted in favour of raising the minimum wage to £15 an hour. Sir Keir Starmer found himself in a row with the left wing of his party as he thinks it should increase to £10 instead. The disagreement saw Labour frontbencher Andy MacDonald resign yesterday. Labour MP Barry Gardiner has told LBC's Cross Question the motion has partly come about after seeing key workers' roles during the pandemic.
They're the glue that holds our society together. And if you're a care worker that has been working without proper PPE, seeing your charges, the people that you've cared for and loved dying, and actually many of your colleagues dying as well, I think society has come to realise that actually, you know what, you're worth £15 an hour.
Police have opened an investigation after a video emerged appearing to show a man with a knife at a petrol station in south-east London. Officers were called to a disturbance outside the Shell garage in Welling yesterday. A court's heard a 36-year-old man charged with murdering primary school teacher Sabina Nessa will plead not guilty. Kochi Salamaj, who's 36, has been remanded in custody after appearing in front of magistrates earlier. The 28-year-old's body was found in Kidbrooke in south-east London earlier this month. The Prince of Wales, the Duchess of Cornwall and the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have been on the red carpet for the world premiere of the new James Bond film. It's being held at the Royal Albert Hall in London. No Time to Die is out in cinemas this Thursday, a year and a half late due to the pandemic. The LBC markets...
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.